Dan was on his school's basketball team, so to speak. So he was part of the team. But he spent most of his time on the bench as a substitute. His presence or absence in the team was the same. Dan lacked confidence. So everybody kept making fun of him, and Dan felt bad. But he didn't have the courage to face anyone. One day at school, a photograph was taken for the official photograph of the basketball team. Took photos of everyone. The next day the team coach gave everyone an envelope containing their photos. But when Dan opened his envelope, he was shocked to see where he was sitting in the team photograph. The place was empty, which Dan found very strange. He went straight to the photographer's studio after school. After going there, he gave his blank photo to the photographer. When he saw the photo, even the photographer became quite confused. Dan insisted the photographer take another photo of him. The photographer was very busy, so he turned Dan down. But the photographer removed the cloth from the ground and opened a safe and put it in. He pulled out a very old antique camera from his camera and handed it to Dan. Dan was thrilled to see the camera in exchange for a photograph. He gave me an antique camera, thanked the photographer and left. As soon as Dan entered the house, he turned the camera lens towards himself. I started cleaning and then suddenly I took a photo with my camera. As soon as the light flashed, a photo instantly came out of that camera. In that photo there was a boy's t-shirt which was torn from the shoulder. Dan thought that maybe it was an old photo, after some time when Dan was going to his room. Then his t-shirt got torn at the shoulder after being pulled by a nail protruding from the door. Dan looked back at the photo that came out of that camera and was stunned. The person in the photograph was none other than Dan himself. Just then Dan's sister suddenly returned home. Dan suddenly pressed the click button of the camera and the photo of the vase lying in the house was taken. A few seconds later, the vase fell down and broke after hitting Dan's sister's bag and Dan. When he saw the photograph from the camera, the same vase was lying broken on the ground in that photo. Dan got very scared and locked the camera in his cupboard. Next morning he goes to his school like a normal day. I was changing my clothes in the changing room of the basketball court. But as soon as he opened his locker, he was shocked. He saw the same camera in that locker. He did not understand how it reached there. But at that moment one of his team members, James, arrived there. James was a huge bully and always bothered Dan. As soon as he arrived he picked up Dan's clothes and scattered them around. Dan started getting very angry. He took out the camera and took a photo of James. The camera flash was so strong that James's eyes closed. That was it, and Dan picked up his clothes and ran away from there. The same day, news came from the school that James was changing his clothes after practice. Then suddenly a big locker from the changing room fell on James and broke his leg. When Dan looked at the photo taken with his camera, James was lying under a cupboard. Seeing that photo, a smile came on Dan's face. Dan was now feeling a different kind of power. With that camera he could have done bad things to anyone. If anyone made fun of him, he could take revenge with just a click of the camera. But Dan's happiness was not going to last long. One day Dan was sitting in his room. He was watching that camera closely. His younger sister came and sat beside him. Dan told his sister about the camera. She said it was magic. There is a camera, and whatever thing or person Dan takes a photo of with that camera, something bad happens to that thing or person. Hearing this, Dan's sister started laughing loudly. She started making fun of Dan and that camera. Then the flash of that camera went off and it seemed as if that camera automatically took a photo of Dan's sister. Dan saw the photo and ran to his sister and pushed her. Dan's sister screamed in anger, but the next moment the chandelier on the ceiling was right there. The place where Dan's sister was standing. Dan gave her the photograph. When her sister saw the photograph, she was shocked. She was lying on the ground in that photograph. And above it was the same chandelier. Now the situation was getting out of Dan's control. Decided that he should use that camera to take the same photograph. Will return the... When Dan arrived at the photographer's studio, he couldn't believe what he saw. The atmosphere of that studio had changed. There was a commercial shoot going on inside and the same photographer who used to wear old clothes earlier. Now he was wearing a very expensive suit. Dan went up to him. But the photographer ignored him as soon as he saw him. Dan grabbed his hand and asked him about the camera. So the photographer took him to a corner and said to him, "For the last 10 years that wretched camera has given me nothing but bad luck. As soon as he left, see how my luck shone. I did not give you that camera. That camera chose you." Dan didn't understand. The photographer then told him that every photograph taken with that camera had a mark on it. That mark is of a devil. He said that the camera gives power to anyone. But that person has to pay its price with his fate. Saying this, the photographer went away from there. Dan was frightened by the words of the photographer and was returning home in a scared state. As soon as he reached the door of the house, he saw that his parents were leaving the house, and then the camera that Dan had in his hands. He took a photo of both of them himself. Dan's parents were getting late for the movies, so he got in his car and left straight away. Dan tried hard to stop them, but they both had gone too far. Dan rushed home in a panic and told his sister everything. Then a photo came out from that camera, and inside that photo, Dan's parents' car was overturned on the road. This meant that Dan's parents were going to have an accident. Dan didn't understand anything. He told them, "I tried to call him, but his phone was not reachable." Dan brought the camera out of the house and broke it against a bed, but then as soon as the two of them came in, the camera was right in the middle of their room, right in the middle of Dan and his sister's hands. It was getting worse now. They had to do something as quickly as possible. Otherwise, their parents' lives were in danger. Then Dan got an idea. He asked his sister to bring a big mirror and place the camera in a mirror. I placed it in front of him and pressed the camera button with the help of a stick from behind the sofa. As soon as the photo was taken, a strange sound came from the camera. It started, and within no time the camera caught fire. It seemed that whoever was inside that camera was also with him. Was burning. A few minutes later, Dan's phone rang. It was his dad on the phone, who told him that both of them had just narrowly escaped an accident. Hearing this, Dan and his sister felt relieved. They happily hugged each other and went to their rooms. He thought that his camera troubles were over forever. But both of them did not know that the mirror in front of which they had placed the camera. Now in the corner of that mirror there was the same mark which was in every photo. That's the devil's mark.